Welcome to the Spe Salvi Institute Podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today we want to talk about the disturbing return of anti-Semitism. It's an appropriate day to do this, Bobby, because today is Yom Kippur as we record this. It is Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in the calendar of Jewish people. That's the Day of Atonement. And sadly, on this Yom Kippur, we have received news that there has been an attack on a synagogue in Manchester, England, where two people have been killed. The sad thing, maybe even beyond just the loss of the lives of these two people, is just how normal this kind of violence has become, certainly in Western Europe, but also in North America. And so I thought that we could take an hour today to talk about this disturbing trend, this kind of violent anti-Semitism that we have seen, but also this kind of strangely respectable anti-Semitism that we are witnessing in Western societies, and then maybe get a little bit into some of the challenges of Islamism and wokeism and how all this stuff kind of balances out as we think about the West. So I don't know where you want to begin, Bobby, but that's our topic for today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic like anti-Semitism with the recent rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses, but throughout even North America. In many respects, you kind of thought that anti-Semitism was one of those things most people knew, that was the road you could not go down. But it seems that on various radical sides of the political spectrum, that has kind of come back, and it's actually somewhat seems to be okay to talk that way. So I mean, ever since the Tree of Life synagogue, the shooting in Pittsburgh so many years ago, and I've been listening to a lot of Barry Weiss on this recently. It's a topic that I think needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and I don't recall the specifics of who was responsible for the Tree of Life shooting, but I do know that the concern always used to be this kind of extreme right-wing anti-Semitism, that there was a kind of neo-Nazi type kind of fascination with Hitler and the Third Reich that fueled a certain type of anti-Semitism, especially violent anti-Semitism in the West. And I do believe that that is still a concern. However, the thing that has really disturbed me in the last couple of years, and probably it's been most pronounced since the start of the war between Israel and Hamas, which began, I believe, almost 2 years ago. We're recording this the first week of October, and October 7th, I believe, would be the 2-year anniversary of the kidnapping, the murder and the kidnapping of the Jewish people. But anyway, it seems like since then, well, maybe I'll back up a second and say I do believe that there has long been this sense of, among some people, kind of on the left, that Palestinians are this particularly oppressed group. And that the Israeli state is kind of participating in this kind of neo-colonial kind of system of oppression type of thing. And so from time to time you'll sort of hear you would hear this, right? Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned before, college campuses, the kind of discrimination that, at least if the reports are to be believed that we've heard, and I have no reason to believe they're not, that is really taking place kind of on the ground in some of our elite institutions now, as supposedly a response to the activities of the Israeli state. That to me is new. And that to me is really disturbing, because it's all bound up now as kind of another piece of this jigsaw puzzle of wokeism and of liberal, of kind of left activism that seems to have its own kind of dogma, its own orthodoxy, and its own lines, which if people cross, they are considered out of bounds or kind of beyond the pale. So I don't know. That's one place where I thought we could start. And, maybe I'll throw it to you with this. I was looking at some videos recently by a woman named Melanie Phillips. And she's a British woman, a Jewish woman who has written a lot about anti-Semitism. And she said this back in March of 2025. She was doing a podcast with John Anderson, and she talked about how she was so baffled by quote progressives marching side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Islamists. And she says it's quite comical if it wasn't so awful because the Islamists would basically, kill them, or some of them, she says, for what they stand for, women's rights, gay rights, etc. She says these things are inimical to Islamic society, but they are bound together by a common aim. They are polar opposites, but bound together by the common aim of destroying the West and hatred of Jews and Israel. So I wonder if we could use that as a jumping off point to say, it appears that there's something to this left version of not just anti-Semitism as a kind of opposition to an ideology called Semitism, which is not really a thing, but rather a kind of disdain for people, the people being the Jews themselves, that is bound up in this kind of struggle for the West that we're living through right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you kind of wonder if it's something kind of like the United Front, saying like the when the Chinese were taking on the Japanese, and so you
Yeah.
have like the nationalists and the communists teaming up, but then you have Shanghai Shek saying going after the communists and saying something like the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communism is the disease of the heart. But that United Front quickly fell apart. But it was a tactical move for the sake of going against a common enemy. Whether that was the warlords or the Japanese. Sorry, I'm going over some of 20th century Chinese history right now, but I was thinking about that. So whether this is just kind of a tactical union that is united just because of a common enemy, which is an imperialistic, capitalistic, militaristic West that has all the power. And this kind of seems to be, kind of a Noam Chomsky way of reading things, where we'll then stand with the oppressed against those who all have clearly the upper hand in terms of power in this case. And so it seems like all the groups that are marginalized and can claim victim status will unite with there will be a solidarity amongst them all. So, the oppressed of the world, unite. So it's interesting. Across the street from the school that I teach at is Masalib Books, which is funny because I believe it is owned by a Jewish guy from New York City who moved to Krakow years ago. But it's a place for me to go get a good read on what's being published in the leftist world at the moment. And they have a big, huge table right in the front when you walk into the bookstore. It's an all English bookstore. It's one of the few all English bookstores in Krakow, and they have a number of all the books that are out there right now are basically about Palestine. They have a bunch of books that are, kind of neo-Marxist books. They have a bunch of books kind of in the LGBT category. And then they also have a bunch of kind of critical theory books. They have a bunch of books that are also by Edward Said. And it's kind of interesting to see this mix of all of that together. And I was thinking to myself, I can't imagine, because we're having a lot of Muslims from the Middle East come up to vacation in Krakow. I can't imagine them being comfortable in this bookstore. So it's kind of odd to find these groups being kind of bedfellows, but I think it is united in the sense of being against the imperialistic, capitalistic aggressors of the West. Um,
Yeah, and somehow maybe we can explain or explore how, but yeah, somehow Israel, and we'll only spend a moment on kind of the state of Israel because I want to kind of come back to Europe and North America and think about this phenomenon of anti-Semitism and maybe Islamism as well in our own places where we live. But a little bit more about Israel is worth saying, Israel Palestine stuff. Somehow, the left often talks about things being coded, right? And so somehow, rather than just sort of looking at reality for what it is, but things are sort of coded as something else, right? So in the kind of Israel-Palestine question, Israel has been coded as white, and Palestine has been coded as people of color. Israel has been coded as privilege, and Palestine has been coded as vulnerable, oppressed, etc. Right? And so that's how these things fit into these like categories that you were kind of alluding to before. And I came across this really interesting article. The European Conservative, by the way, they've been reporting and publishing really great stuff for a number of years now about this question of kind of the place of Jewish people in the West versus this question of how to deal with the kind of mass of Islamic immigration and all of that kind of thing. So they've chronicled really closely. There've been a lot of great reports about anti-Semitism, and by anti-Semitism, again, I don't mean opposition to an ideology called Semitism, but actual acts of violence or discrimination against Jewish people. But there's an article that they published. Let's see when it was. It was a few months ago, but I think it was back in March. Yeah. And it was called Antisemitism as Anti-Semitism as Anti-Europeanism by Proxy. And it was interesting because it sort of approached this question from both perspectives. It approached the question of looking at this sort of, this situation going on in the Holy Land right now. The author says this: Israel is not being opposed because it is a Jewish state, but rather because it is a Western one, which is, kind of what we were saying before, represents kind of all these things that in the eyes of the left represent kind of, going back to the conversation we had last week, represent kind of just this sort of inherent brokenness, evilness, all of that sort of stuff, right? But the guy also, the author of this also makes the point that kind of opposing this anti-Semitism has also given some people in the West the ability to kind of stick up for the West, because this isn't so much the case in North America, but a little bit more the case in Europe, where people who love the Western tradition can't so easily just stand up in respectable circles and say, hey, I think the West is great and we need to defend it, which I think is a perfectly wonderful thing to say. But they're actually able to kind of, in a sense, almost use their own kind of right-coded language to say, I think it's awful that this anti-Semitism is going on, right? And sort of almost like sort of in the minds of the opposition, this equals the West is a good thing, and what's, the values that you're trying to kind of impose upon it are bad, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, maybe being in Europe, but I thought that was an interesting perspective on this kind of question of how anti-Semitism kind of plays out in these wider debates.
Yeah. I don't know. In Europe, the perspective it's interesting because you have a bunch of figures, at least in Poland, on the right, who there's strong accusations of anti-Semitism. On the left, you have not so much that you find in at least accusations of that. And so, what's interesting with the Gaza war going on, you'll hear a number of figures who, in some ways, will, like a lot of kind of the anti-Semitic tropes will be coming out again with that. But not so much in terms of, at least from what I've heard from the left here. But it's
That's
interesting, like now with Macron and with what's the prime minister's name again
Yeah, Keir Starmer.
Yeah. Okay. Them, putting forward the suggestion of a Palestinian state. And I'm not so sure
recognizing Palestine. I mean, Macron recognized the state of Palestine from the floor of the United Nations, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting development there. But
versus, if I could just say quickly, versus someone like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who has, decidedly spoken against that and said there's no way there's going to be any recognition of a Palestinian state until, this, and this are done. I mean, some of the things that I think have been articulated by President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu in their proposal for a ceasefire, actually, you know. But anyway,
Yeah.
I digress.
No, I'm not. I'm actually. I don't. I'm not really up to date on everything that's going on around that. But you would think that, after years of being taught, and rightfully so, about the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, that there would be a little bit more of a sensitivity to that. But it seems that because of this war, there's a it's almost legitimizes falling back into some of these anti-Semitic tropes for some.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's weird how on the one hand, World War II is still sort of the fundamental, yeah, or sort of the clearest lens through which we look to see the present, but it sort of is only done so when it serves a particular purpose, because, if we want to make someone seem like a bad guy, then Hitler is the best comparison, obviously. But if we want to kind of relativize something as being not as big a deal as people make it out to be, we can say, well, the Holocaust was a long time ago or something like that, which is, just pretty shocking to say. I wonder if we could think about this question of anti-Semitism. There are a lot of things we want to get to, I think, but I proposed earlier to you before we were recording that we take a look at Pierre Manon's book, which is called Beyond Radical Secularism: How France and the Christian West Should Respond to the Islamic Challenge. We both have a copy of it. And there are a couple of things I wanted to draw out from this. One of them is found in chapter 6, where he talks specifically about the question of the status of Jews in Europe.
Hmm.
And he talks about the word anti-Semitism, which I think is worth our time to talk about a little bit today. He says that he says this. He says we make a very
What
wide and
page is
even.
this, Andrew?
Sorry, Bobby, on page 33. If any of
Okay.
our listeners or viewers happen to have this book, you can follow along. But if you don't, it's no big deal because we're going to tell you some of the things that we want to point to. But Manon says here, we make very wide and even careless use of the term anti-Semitism. And to jump down just a little bit, he says, hunting down anti-Semitism springs essentially from the same anachronism as putting our faith in secularism. And I think what he's getting at here, Bobby, is he's saying something like, look, we're thinking the wrong way about this question of anti-Semitism because we're thinking of it as one of the unacceptable prejudices within this pluralistic world that we are supposedly inhabiting, right? If we all agree that secularism is the water that we're swimming in, and within secularism there's no room for any kind of prejudice, then, whether it be some kind of racism or Islamophobia or homophobia or like whatever these categories may be, then obviously we all agree anti-Semitism is one of those things that we find unacceptable. But the thing he's trying to point to, I think, is
Hmm.
that this secularism that we supposedly inhabit is a mirage. It's not real. Because we have living within this society groups of people who simply will not accept it, who simply will not participate in it. Now, there may be some Christian groups who simply refuse to organize themselves or to think of themselves as participating in a kind of pluralistic secular society. There, I think, have maybe even been some calls to Christians to do a bit more of that, to kind of reject this kind of mirage of secularism. But the point that Pierre Manon makes throughout this book is that the one group that has come to the West that absolutely refuses to live within that paradigm is the Muslim population.
Hmm.
And therefore, the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing, at least coming from kind of Islamist individuals and groups, is not it is not the same kind of anti-Semitism that maybe a lot of people think it is. And in fact, Manon says it like he puts it like this. He says, the word that fits the new reality is the word war. A war against us has been declared and is happening. This is a war that sometimes targets only Jews, in which case we can speak of a war against the Jews. At other times, it targets them along with Christians, blasphemers, the police, and in general, the authorities and institutions of Western nations. Finally, it targets not only all of these, but also the apostate Muslims. In such a situation, to limit oneself to denouncing anti Semitism makes no sense at all. And I think he's really onto something here, Bobby, about equating anti Semitism, and in particular prejudice and violence against the Jewish people, with a larger war against the traditional West.
Yeah.
And in this way, although Manon isn't really talking about it in the book, we can see again how that connection, this strange bedfellowship, ends up getting made between Islamists and, for lack of a better term, the woke left.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit further. On page 34, he says this. He says the idea that we might be the object of enmity and that this enmity might be based at least in part on reasons that would have to be called religious is something we cannot conceive. We
Right.
find it easier and more pleasant to believe or to pretend to believe that the Venerable Republic is fighting an ever-recurring anti-Semitism than to consider that the whole human realm to which we belong is the object of a certain religious enmity that motivates a war in which the Jews are a permanent but not exclusive target.
Yes.
Um, that thing when he says too that's hard, that we can't even conceive of it being a part, one of the reasons being religious. Even for the secular folk is causing, I think, a lot of people who were just in the secular realm. You think of historians like Tom Holland, you think of others who may see a practical need for religion, for society, but they're getting maybe becoming a little bit more aware of the religious component to it. It's quite interesting that I think that like now, because I forget when this was written, maybe in 2015, because there
Yeah.
were a number of attacks. I mean, this is you had the I forget when the Charlie Hebdo attacks
Right.
took place.
Yeah, so this book was written in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which happened in January of
Okay.
2015.
Yes.
And then, I mean, it's such a prophetic book because although it's a response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, 2015 also, as the book is coming out, proved to be this sort of sea change moment for Europe where all the migrants were, basically European society changed in the year 2015, purely and simply, So, I mean,
So
I
you
think
had a
that's a
big shift
really,
even in Poland. I mean, you had the
yeah,
election of
yeah.
peace and a bunch of in response to all of that.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe this is a topic for another podcast, but I mean, just think of that was just 10 years ago, 2015. We're recording this in the fall of 2025. And, not only did the migration phenomenon happen in Europe, but I mean, so many other things have changed in Western society since 2015.
Hmm.
I mean, gay marriage, for example, the entire emergence of the trans movement. So many things. I mean, Donald Trump becoming president and sort of resetting the whole kind of at least American political calculus, right? So many things like that. But one thing I wanted to point out to you, maybe there's more you want to say more about that, but I wanted to connect this just briefly with something that I wrote for our site a couple of years ago,
Hmm.
called I wrote an article called Islam and the West, The Dilemma of Young Ahmed, which is about a movie, nominally about a movie by the Dardenne brothers of Belgium called Young Ahmed, which they released in 2019. Um, the main thing I want to say about that to begin is I started that article in reference to something that I think is particularly pertinent as we consider Manon's perspective. Because again, Manon's book was written in response to the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris in January of 2015. Right after that happened, the infamous Harvey Weinstein, the movie producer, the American movie producer, he wrote an article. Um, Excuse me for now blanking on where this article was. Yes, he wrote an article in Variety, a column in Variety, on the eve of an awards show. I believe it was the Screen Actors Guild, no, the Golden Globe Awards. Sorry, so it was on the eve of the Golden Globe Awards. He wrote this article in the magazine Variety, and he began with this typical kind of old-fashioned liberal defense of free speech, which almost seems kind of quaint now, right?
Mhm.
When we think about this. But he said that the Charlie Hebdo massacre, he said it was, quote, a stunning blow against freedom of speech and freedom of joy. And he says that this has become a fight of good versus evil. In other words, he was still thinking of it from this secularist perspective, the perspective of there are some people who hate free speech, or there are some, rather than thinking of really a war that is raging within the civilization. And this was, I thought, just particularly naive. And maybe I'll get your thoughts on this. But he says, he defended kind of pluralism and free speech and all these kinds of things. And he ended his article by saying, I hope we can all raise glasses to toast with the 300 million viewers around the world. Je suis Charlie, je suis juif, je suis Ahmed. I am Charlie, I'm Jewish, I am Ahmed, right? Meaning that we can all just kind of find common ground. And it was particularly funny that he said raise a glass because, of course, Muslims officially don't drink. But what a kind of funny viewpoint, right? Coming and putting aside completely the obvious later moral failings that we come to understand and prosecute, I guess, about this man Harvey Weinstein. But that look, our differences really aren't that big a deal. We can put them aside because we all sort of enjoy, we can all do what we want here. We can watch whatever TV shows that we want. If we have enough money, we can buy whatever clothes we want. Let's all just raise a glass and celebrate that. To me, that just fundamentally misunderstands the problem. Do you agree, Bobby?
No, I agree. And I think this is the problem with a lot of people who think that kind of integration was going to be an easy thing. And like they thought, oh, okay, well, since globalization is a phenomenon, maybe in terms of like America, having their shows being projected around the world. So oh, okay, so I guess, people in Iran or wherever around the world are all familiar with like Michael Jordan. They're familiar with Michael Jackson music. They're watching the same movies that we watch. That at the end of the day, the religion thing is secondary, that they'll just eventually all kind of absorb and we'll all be the same. And
Hmm.
there's like multiple probably reasons why that maybe didn't happen. But I think that no, religion is quite a serious phenomenon. And this is something that like I think a lot of people like, if you want to say the secular, I don't want to say secular elites, but like people who tend to downplay that. And that's why they really don't understand a lot of Americans who see religion as primary. They
Hmm.
don't, sometimes in Europe, this is a little bit hard, I think, for Western Europeans who may actually think of their ethnic identity as actually more primary than even now their religious identity is like, oh, religion is something I've heard a Spanish guy say, religion, oh, Catholicism was like a little toy that we played with once and now we've kind of put it away. And so
Hmm.
you can have a response, well, to the failure to integrate, where it's almost like it's almost an ethnic reaction to it, and you can fall into that can go into dangerous territory. But I think at the heart of it is really there's a fundamental religious root that makes that the secular people are a part of that world that appreciates that they can critique certain things as much as they want and they're not going to be afraid, at least in the West, with like Christians of at least now of being killed.
Yeah.
And so the it's just interesting that I think that's kind of like so easily dismissed. But at the same time, I mean, I've been listening to a little bit of Christopher Caldwell and his book. I actually haven't read his book yet, which I mean to do that, on Europe and Islam. I forget the exact name of the that book, but that came out a number of years ago, even before the Charlie Hebdo thing, I think, and or around that time. And he mentions that in Europe, there's just there's such at this time, at least in Western Europe, there's such a hesitancy to bring anything positive for somebody to be integrated into. They're so hung up on the sins of the past and can only see, like and only see that in themselves. as the oppressors and the aggressors, that they give nobody the people nothing to really want to cherish and embrace. And
Hmm.
at the same time in Europe, which I think has made it harder in Europe maybe than in America, is that a lot of the immigrants who were coming were actually coming into welfare states, and there was a big push for them not even to work. And so a lot of people were not becoming um, integrated in the same way that it was very successful for immigrants in America to integrate was precisely through work and being with other Americans. But I do think the religious element, it will be interesting to see in America how that plays out, whether or not work is going to do that with Muslim immigrants. Um, and it's also interesting too. I mean, go off on this a little bit further, but the people will oftentimes say that Islam will go through something like a Reformation. You know, they'll put it along the lines of something like the Protestant Reformation and all that. But the people who believe that are such a small minority within that
Hmm.
community. And also to be, they're oftentimes corrected by scholars such as even like somebody who know. I mean, I'm not trying to have any pretensions to be an Islamic scholar or anything like that, but somebody who knows Arabic quite well, as Remy Bragg,
Yeah.
okay, he
Yep.
always calls this out that you could take any of these passages and try to fit that into why it would then make Islam as capable of being part of the kind of secular West and
Hmm.
separate, religion from politics. And he's like, and so you can quote all of these um, different things in the Quran, but there's actually with with when you what do you call that when you one actually surah uh, abrogates another.
Uh-huh.
So in the tradition, what is it that you are actually commanded to follow? Oftentimes that doesn't fit as well with the picture of
Right.
this kind of reformed Islam that these people want.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like our leaders in the West have bet our entire civilization on wishful thinking, uh, connected to extreme minority views of the potential for Muslims and maybe others as well to transform themselves. You know, I think that we've assumed so much. I mean, it reminds me a little bit. You know, the stakes for this are lower, I think, but it reminds me a little bit of people who sort of put an enormous amount of weight on maybe a minority liberal view about certain things that they wish would change about the Catholic Church, but I mean, but aren't ever going to change, you know? And yet it's sort of like assumed to be like, well, there's actually a diversity of viewpoints here. There's actually every reason to believe that this or whatever. And it's sort of like, really, the scales are just way tipped in the opposite direction, but people just don't want to see that, which is strange. In this, by the way, just to close the loop on this young Ahmed thing, this article that I wrote about this film, this Dardenne brothers film, I say in my piece that I don't believe the Dardenne brothers were trying to make a movie showing the incompatibility of Islam and the West, but I do believe ultimately that is what their film basically shows. You know, I mean, it's a very good movie, but it's about a boy who's half Arab and half Belgian and lives in Belgium, and he's really struggling with his identity as teenagers do, and ends up in a lot of trouble. And you know, I'll leave it to. I don't need to rehearse the entire thing today, but the sense that you get at the end is where is someone like this going to fit? It's going to be difficult. So, that's an important thought. I thought maybe we could return to thinking about anti-Semitism a little bit, Bobby, by not neglecting this fact that we alluded to before, which is there is anti-Semitism on the right within the West as well. And an important thing that I think needs to be stated over and over again is that anti Semitism is totally unacceptable for Christians, for Catholics. And let me just share this with you, and maybe you want to go in, I don't know, any direction you want. But I was looking at Nostra Aetate again today,
Yeah.
kind of thinking about our conversation today, and I've now lost. I had it all queued up. I was going to share. Um, Hang on one second. I'm going to find this. Yeah, the Nostra Aetate explores this idea that's kind of a common trope in the West about blaming the Jews for the death of Christ. And it makes this point. It says the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. And then it goes on to say, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time and by anyone. And I like there that, again, it's not just theoretical, but it is actually discussing, displays of hatred or persecutions or violence, that sort of thing against Jewish people. And also kind of dealing in this, I think, very succinct way with this big question that has kind of dogged us in Western civilization about kind of this question of the role of the Jews in the death of Christ. So I have more to say about that, but I thought I would get your thoughts on that as our entry point as we also address this problem of anti-Semitism from what we might almost call the woke right nowadays. There's the woke left. We've talked about them a lot, but there seems to be this sort of other group that is on the other side that is trying to get us to kind of be aware of all these things that are actually pretty sinister sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was always shocking to me that, on, I don't know if it's in the Good Friday service, but, I don't know if that was right before Vatican II when they exactly stopped doing this, but one of the prayers was for the perfidious Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I first heard that, I was just quite shocked that was, like only several years ago that they stopped praying for that. And it's interesting that there's some people I think on the right who oftentimes, and you find this in some even I don't know if in certain Catholic circles, but sometimes they'll have this nostalgia or this grass is always greener on the other side kind
Nostalgia
of
in a bad way. We've talked about how nostalgia can be good.
Yeah, for this kind of like Vatican II church in which, they are kind of unashamed to, and they almost take this kind of in like a manly way, like call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
And, this kind of wimpy Catholicism came around in which, they're all kind of sensitive about, what we say, but, they're just going to say it. But sometimes, they'll in their kind of idolization of the past and they'll even take things like that and then they'll buy into certain other myths like the protocols of the elders of Zionism,
Right.
and some of these other things that you find coming back. And it's interesting too, you find some people like even with 9/11 getting into, well, it must have been, okay, Mossad. And then now with even the Epstein, we're talking about the article that Matthew Schmidt wrote about the Epstein myth and how some
Mm-hmm.
of this stuff is kind of these anti-Semitic tropes are coming back to say how
Yeah.
it's all connected. And it's just the kind of globalist, as the kind of right critiques globalist elites, they're going to try to then almost put this kind of, almost like it's a Jewish plot to control the world. That is coming back.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of people have particularly noted that this is coming out in the work of Candace Owens. I don't follow Candace Owens, but I'm given to understand that this is now one of the major themes, or something like this is one of the major themes in her commentary. There have been people who have critiqued Tucker Carlson as well for similar reasons. I have to admit that I have pretty much stopped paying attention to Tucker Carlson ever since he has been kind of publicly rethinking certain aspects of the legacy of World War II. I think it's just wrong. And I'm not saying that he doesn't ever have anyone on his show worth listening to, and he doesn't say anything worth listening to. I think he does, but I do think he's playing with fire with some of that stuff. And to that point, maybe you have a thought about this. Tucker Carlson spoke at Charlie Kirk's memorial service, the big service that they had at the football stadium in Phoenix. And I didn't think anything about it when I heard him speak. I thought it was perfectly fine. But after the fact, I noticed that some people were taking issue with the fact that he sort of equated Charlie's martyrdom with Christ's death, with Christ's persecution and death. And he specifically said, and I had it written down here so I didn't get it wrong. He specifically talked in his little tribute about how Jesus was killed by, quote, hummus eaters in Jerusalem. And there were a lot of people who kind of flagged that and said that's an anti-Semitic wink right there, you know. I've been pondering that a little bit more and thinking about that. I don't know if that's precisely what Tucker was trying to do. Well, let me put it this way. I don't know if Tucker was trying to equate Jesus being killed by Jews with Charlie Kirk being killed by Jews, which apparently some people have, again, like 9/11 and like Epstein and like some of these other things, there have developed, supposedly, I haven't really delved too deeply, but online, certain conspiracy theories about how it was, yet again, who else? The Jews who killed Charlie Kirk, which seems to me just ludicrous on the face of it, since we know the constituency, as it were, to which the killer or the alleged killer belongs. But that having been said, I still think it's a little bit odd that Tucker would say that on that big stage about the hummus eaters killing Jesus, because I do think that is a little bit of a dig against precisely the quote that I read a moment ago from Nostra Aetate, which is to say, I mean, Jesus, yes, of course, Jesus was killed by his own kinsmen who rejected him. Yes, we get that. And they wanted the Romans to do that, and the Romans were implicated in it too. And so it's all a little bit complicated. However, there is no blood guilt down through the centuries to the present day against the people that Jesus was born into, right? That's just flatly wrong. And so to kind of like bring that up on a big stage like that, I think that was a bit irresponsible by Tucker personally. Although I guess maybe the counterpoint would be to say maybe the Romans were eating hummus too. Who knows who he was talking about these hummus eaters? Maybe they all ate hummus over there and it wasn't just the Jews. The long and the short of it is I've come back around to kind of feeling a little bad, feeling like I really wish Tucker hadn't said that, and it makes me feel a little bit worse about him, to be honest.
Yeah, but it is kind of concerning that, this is the direction. Well, it seems like actually kind of like hinting at some of this that they're moving in.
Yeah.
You're finding a lot of people who have that kind of globalist conspiracy, but then inevitably it has to be tied to the Jews. I remember a couple of years ago, it was like, I don't know when Kanye West kind of went off, into crazy land when he was saying, well, it's okay. Well, you have Jared, the son-in-law of Trump is controlling him. And then you have, I forget who else it was, but there was always some relation. And then you had like some of the jokes of Dave Chappelle, when you about I don't know if you remember his jokes about when you see a group of Italians together, you call it the mafia. Okay, when you have a group of you know blacks together, it's a gang, and then when Jews, it's a kind of coincidence. But they're kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
hinting at this.
Right. Right.
That seems to be like, okay, I'm in the inside. I know how all, and this is how Tucker comes across. This is, I know how it all works. Okay, guys, I've been in the industry for years. Trust me when I say this. I
Mm-hmm.
know how it all works. And
Mm-hmm.
it seemed to be that was kind of a little bit what Dave Chappelle was hinting at as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, yeah, maybe we shouldn't go too far down this road, but I do think that I think the points that you've made are really sound and sort of what I was trying to get at as well. Especially because people like Tucker and Candace are people who are publicly Christian, right?
Mhm.
Um, Now Dave Chappelle, I'm not so sure about Kanye
He's
West.
Muslim. I think Dave Chappelle's Muslim.
Okay. Wow. Well, I didn't actually realize that.
Yeah.
Um, I do think there's one other category maybe we could just touch on very briefly, which is kind of the post-Christian. We've talked about these kind of like, Bapism, like kind of Bronze Age pervert type right-wing male, this sort of,
Yeah.
They think Christianity is very soft. They think that we're all just like very naive about this whole turn the other cheek thing and,
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and
yeah.
all of this sort of thing. Now, I'm not necessarily equating them to Adolf Hitler. But I have long thought that it is that in some respects, all you need to know about where Hitler is going to go eventually is in his initial renunciation of his belonging to the Christian empire into which he was born. I really do when I think about that, like how he couldn't wait to get out of Austria and go fight for the Prussians
Hmm.
to me is just and I'm not even saying Prussia was thoroughgoing in its anti-Semitism. There were plenty of Jews who fought bravely and were decorated for their service in World War
Yeah.
One.
Yeah.
But there is something about kind of the Prussian military ethos, which is very different from the sort of diverse Christian imperium that existed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
How
right?
much he hated Vienna precisely
Hated it,
because of,
hated Vienna. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I
It's
don't know. I
interesting to
just
think
wanted
he
to
might
raise
have been
that.
a fellow student with Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
Um, and you wonder where a lot of those, if you want to call them jealousies, might have stemmed from.
Mm.
I mean, Wittgenstein was a smart cookie.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I do think, like, just to close that loop, that I do think that there is a certain fascination with some of the old, frankly, kind of old-fashioned
Hmm.
anti-Semitism among some of these types who have moved beyond Christianity. And so, I mean, I think that this is
Yeah.
important. I really wanted us to kind of name the absurdity of the kind of Islamist woke left bedfellowship, but I do really think that we need to continue to combat the 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 same, not the same problem, but kind of uh, the same target. We need to. I don't know where I was going with this, but anyway, the same
Yeah.
problem on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the kind of the stress on the need for roots and being on the land and the place that this is coming back. I mean, you look at I think they recently discovered some of Heidegger's, they call it the Black Notebooks. And it's interesting how, he bought into a lot of that the conspiracy about, you know, the globalism, the rootlessness,
Hmm.
the attempt for planetary kind of governmental structures instead of actually coming from a locality.
Hmm.
And it seems that like with a lot of people who on the right who desire that rootedness and being connected to the land, they may delve into some of that literature and be convinced of those same anti-Semitic tropes.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe that's a topic to pick up another time. But I'm really glad we had this conversation today about this topic. We definitely haven't gone down every avenue that we could have done. But we hope that our listeners and viewers will have taken something away from this because I know that a lot of our friends, a lot of our followers are as concerned about this as we are, that we perceive this really is a problem related to our future flourishing as we contemplate the prospect of renewing the West.
Yeah.
And that is a precious idea to us.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that this anti-Semitism that comes from different directions is an assault on that project.
Yeah. And it seems too that like I mean just a point that Remy Bragg makes that when we think about like Judaism and um and Christianity, it's all about God in relationship with his people. He gives the laws, but it's always about liberation. I
Hmm.
set you free. I set you free. And it's not so, even the commandments are not like commandments as we think of them, but they're actually the same. I think their actual word is the sayings. but now that you're free, this is how you are to behave as free men and women, you know?
Hmm.
And yet Christ, even when God introduces himself and he describes, almost like, okay, I'm Bob, I'm a teacher. What does he do? He's the one who sets you free. I am the one who liberates you from Egypt. And it seems that like a lot of this is in a way that notion perhaps maybe of freedom that is at the kind of the root of our civilization that is I wouldn't want to say that maybe that is what they identify as the problem, but maybe that is part of it.
Yeah, well said, and a good place to end. So I think on that note, we'll wrap up and we'll look forward to proposing another topic and discussing it with each other for next time. But until then, we hope that everybody will just continue to support what we're doing. Check out our website, spesalviinstitute.com. Follow us, share these podcasts if you enjoy listening to them so we can continue to grow. So until next time, we wish all of you all of God's blessings, and we encourage you to live in hope.